It's certainly my pleasure to welcome everyone to this Capital Projects Grant informational webinar. This is the first Capital Projects webinar we've held for 2021. As Kalina said, my name is Caroline Miller. I'm the chair of the BC Association for Charitable Gaming. I am speaking to you this afternoon from the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people in Kelowna, BC, and we thank them for their rich heritage, which we are able to enjoy. The BCACG is an umbrella organization which is active across the province, and we have worked closely with the BC Gaming branch for many years. Our role is to help bring not-for-profit organizations information about the provincial gaming grant program, including both community gaming grants and, for the past few years, the capital projects grants. We would welcome any of you as new members of the BCACG at any time, as well as invite you to our annual symposium this year held on October 28th and 29th virtually. More information can be found on our website, bcacg.com. Over 180 people registered for this first workshop as the 2021 Capital Projects Grant cycle opened June 1st. We are all delighted at the strong response. On behalf of my board, our executive director, Kalina Kwan, and all our members, I thank you for taking the time today to find out more about this important program. Bringing you the information today are two senior staff from the gaming branch who I will introduce and then turn the workshop over to them. First, David Pyatt, Acting Executive Director. David works closely with his staff of analysts and reports on outcomes and policy issues up through their overseeing ministry, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, which is headed up by Minister Josie Osborne. She's MLA for Mid-Island Pacific Rim. David will be ably assisted today by Denise Mahon, Manager of Policy and Community Outreach, whom some of you have likely already met via email or telephone.
All right. So as I mentioned, oh, sorry, my thing keeps popping back to the webcam view here. Let me minimize you guys so that I'm not getting distracted. All right, here we go. So we're going to start off with an overview of the Capital Project Grant Program. I'm going to go through the different eligibility for the program, so for organization, for project, and for financial. David is going to talk us through the assessment and scoring piece, as well as spending the grant, and then I'll jump back in again to talk about applying for the grant and some resources at the end. Caroline gave her traditional land acknowledgement, and I'll just give mine from where I'm currently talking to you all from. So I'm speaking to you today from Victoria, which is on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen people, known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. So at this point, because we're all in different locations, I always like to invite everyone to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands that they're viewing the presentation from. Okay, so the overview of the Capital Project Grant. Before we kind of talk about the grant itself, we'll talk about the sort of overall situation of the grant. So we have $140 million annually that we give out through two of our programs. This is all funded with commercial gaming revenue. We have our $135 million community gaming grant program, and that is focused on helping not-for-profits to deliver their ongoing programs. We also have a separate $5 million capital project grant program, which is what we're talking about today, and that's more focused on helping not-for-profits with capital projects or acquisitions. So the 2021 is actually the 5th year of this program. The real objective of the Capital Project Grant is to enable not-for-profits to complete capital projects that provide significant benefits to their communities. This program is specifically for capital projects that have a total cost of between 20,000 to 1.25 million. And we are strict on this amount. And the reason is that we're looking for projects that are really within the scope of a not-for-profit organization. So we're not looking to fund mega projects or multi-year projects. It's really kind of in the locus of a not-for-profit. We can fund between 20 and 50% of the total cost of a project. The percent depends on the cost of the project and the total grant amount, and I'll give an example of how that works in a moment. We are able to provide grants of a maximum of 250,000 through this program. And applicants must demonstrate that they have the matching funds that are required for the project completion. In other words, there's no shortfall to cover the entire project budget. And the matching funds must be on hand at the time of the application. We do accept some bona fide commitments, but funding in hand is always a stronger case for your application. And the applicant's matching funds must equal or exceed the level of capital project funding that's being requested. So for example, if you were an organization with a $500,000 total project budget and you request the maximum of $250,000, so that would be essentially 50% of the project budget. The applicant organization has to demonstrate that it has the matching funds to complete the project. So in this case, that would be the other 50% of the project budget and or $250,000, however you want to look at it. In another scenario, the organization applying would have a total project budget of 1.25 million and request the maximum of $250,000, which in this case would represent 20% of the project budget. In that instance, the applicant organization has to demonstrate that they have the matching funds to complete the entire project, which in this case is that remaining $1 million or the other 80% of the project cost. So that's kind of how the percentages work. Successful applicants will get what they've applied for, assuming they've met all those conditions of the grant and the requirements. And the last thing I'll mention, and we'll talk more about this in a bit, is that the assessment process is competitive. So what this means is that applicants are really encouraged to put together a complete and strong application, as you know, everyone else is going to be doing the same thing. So the intake for the capital project grant this year, as Caroline mentioned, it opened on June 1st and it will be open until July 31st. And we expect that notifications will start going out around late fall of 2021. Organizations can only submit one application per year for this program and for one project only. So not for phases of projects or cascading projects, just one total incomplete project. And there should only be one lead in the application or project. Organizations can work with other organizations or get their support, but there needs to be one organization that assumes responsibility for it, and that should be clear in the application. And the other thing I'll mention is that organizations can still apply for their regular community gaming grant. These programs are considered separate from each other. As I mentioned, it is a competitive application process. So for this, it's competitive. So applicants must make the strongest case possible in each section of the application, just mindful that other applicants are also trying to do the same thing. Providing complete information and documentation is super important. Incomplete, inaccurate, or missing documentation will significantly weaken the application. We don't accept late applications, so be sure to submit your application on time. And grants aren't awarded until all applications are received and reviewed, because all applications are reviewed and assessed at the same time. So what's new for this year for the Capital Project Grant Program? Well, undoubtedly, the biggest factor over the past year in everyone's life has been COVID-19. And last year, in response, we adapted our capital project program policies to allow applications for projects that were needed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, what that meant is that organizations could submit applications for projects or acquisitions that were needed in order to modify how they were delivering their programs and services as a direct result of the pandemic. So these would be things like modifications to facilities to support physical distancing, maybe acquiring some IT equipment to deliver their programs online, things like that. As well as projects or acquisitions that support organizations which have increased or experienced an increase in demand. A lot of these things were, vehicles to deliver food or other essential goods, renovations to expand shelter capacity, and things like that. So these are just some of the ways that groups were being impacted, and our program responded to help meet that demand. And as capital projects are often many years in the making, and recognizing the impacted financial situation of many organizations, minimum matching funds contribution for the program was reduced from 50% to 20% for projects or acquisitions that met either of that COVID-19 project criteria. So for 2021, these projects will continue to be supported to help organizations respond to the impacts of COVID-19, but recognizing that many organizations have now implemented those necessary changes to the delivery of their programs or services, capital project applications for both regular and COVID-19 projects will be assessed on equal consideration for this year. And these changes are part of our annual update to our capital project sector guide. And in addition to these changes, we've just made small updates to clarify and improve the existing policy. So adding more examples, rewording sections, providing additional information and things like that. And all these are within the spirit of trying to continually improve the program and make it easier to understand and accessible. So as I just mentioned, we have our capital project sector guide. It's our main policy document for the program, and it is available on our website. So these guidelines will have those new changes reflected for the year, as well as all information about our program. So we strongly encourage you to read through these in advance of preparing and submitting your application, whether it's completely new to you or just as a refresh. So now I'm going to move on and talk a bit about eligibility. First, we'll start with the organization eligibility. So it's very similar to our main community gaming grant program, if you're familiar with that. As I mentioned at the top, this program is really meant for not-for-profit organizations. So you must be a not-for-profit to be an eligible organization. The organization must operate primarily for community benefit and deliver or facilitate programs that are within one of the community gaming grant's 6 sectors, which, if you're not familiar, is arts and culture, sport, environment, public safety, human and social services, and parent advisory council or district parent advisory councils. The organization must have an open membership, and they must have a volunteer board and voting membership, and there must be double the number of voting members to board members. So say you have 5 board members, you must have at least 11 or more voting members in your organization. And those board members must be democratically chosen, and at least 2/3 of them must reside in BC. And board members do not receive any remuneration for their role as board members for the organization. And on the other side of the coin, in eligible organizations, goes without saying, hopefully, that for-profit organizations would not be eligible for this program. Similarly, member-funded societies, which is a specific type of society under the Societies Act. Any political party, political action group, or lobby group would not be eligible, as would not be any type of government from federal to local. Education institutions or schools and provincially or municipally operated facilities are also not eligible for this grant. So in order to assess the organization's eligibility, we require the following documents to do so. If you are part of the or apply to the community gaming grant program, this is the same thing here again too. So we do require the constitution and bylaws if you haven't provided that to us in the last 2 years. We also require the board of directors list and minutes from the most recent annual general meeting. Okay, so now we'll move on to project eligibility. So we do have different project eligibility for the different categories of this program. As I mentioned, there is only one grant application per applicant that's allowed, and only one project per grant. So applicants can apply for only one of these project categories in an application. So an organization could apply for a whole bunch of building restoration activities, but they also couldn't apply for a fleet of vehicles. That would be two different categories. So organizations need to pick one project that they need to complete, because what we're really trying to do is see the successful completion of a total project, not half completion of a few different projects. So the three categories we have, the first is facilities. So that's really about constructing new facilities or renovating or maintaining existing facilities. So things that might fall under here, things like purchasing new or used buildings, community or childcare facility, recovery house, any interior or exterior renovation to a building, HVAC systems. We've seen elevators, tennis bubbles, lighting, even curling club refrigeration. The second category is community infrastructure, and that's about the development of public amenities that improve BC residents' quality of life. So things like that would fall under this category would be things like playgrounds, outdoor structures, community spaces, skate parks, hiking or walking trails, public wharfs, and even ecosystem restoration. And finally, the third would be acquisition. So that's about purchasing fixed capital assets for long-term ownership and use by the applicant organization. So these are those hard, tangible assets like vehicles, buses, computer systems, IT equipment, audiovisual equipment, sports equipment, and even boats. And just to make it clear, we're looking for those hard assets. So we don't fund things like research or development. We're looking for those hard assets. So each project has its own eligibility, or project category rather, has its own eligibility criteria. So the criteria for facilities and community infrastructure is quite similar, just given the nature of what it is. So for this, we're looking to see that the project is being undertaken by an eligible organization for community benefit. The project must be accessible to the public upon completion, and it must be located on either land that's owned by the eligible organization, land that's leased to an eligible organization on a long-term basis, and for this we're looking at 10 years or more, or on public land. And I'll just note here about the accessible to the public that, there are some facilities by their nature that cannot be completely open to the public, particularly if they're meant to serve a certain segment of the population. For example, daycares or recovery houses. So what we're really getting at is that it's reasonably open to anyone who would have an interest in utilizing the completed project. It's not just closed for a specific membership of people. And acquisitions, they have slightly different criteria, again, due to their nature. So what we're looking at here is that the acquisition is necessary for the delivery of a program or service. The acquisition is purchased by an eligible organization, primarily for community benefit, again. The project is for the purchase of privately owned fixed capital assets for long-term use, and that the capital asset must fully belong to that eligible organization. And now on to financial eligibility. So there are a few different things that we're looking to see for the financial eligibility here. Similar to our community gaming grant program, all organizations must have a separate gaming account in order to receive the funding. So what we're looking to see is a void gaming account check that's attached to the application. Any restricted funds that the organization has set aside for this project would be used in full toward the matching fund requirement. Obviously, as I mentioned at the start, having those matching funds is really important. This means that the matching funds contribution must equal or exceed the level of capital project funding requested, depending on the budget size and how much you're requesting in grant funding. And if you are a past a recipient of the community gaming grants, you must be up to date and in good standing with the submission of your gaming account summary reports, which we'll talk a little bit about those a little bit later. So to assess the financial eligibility, there are a couple different documents that we look at. So we look at the revenue and expense statement for the previous fiscal year, or the most recently complete fiscal year is another way of putting it. The balance sheet for the previous fiscal year, as well as the organization budget for the current fiscal year, and any accompanying notes to the financial statements for the previous fiscal year. And we look at the financial information in order to determine its financial capacity, the organization's financial capacity to proceed with the project. And this is the same information as what we require with our community gaming grant program. So I think that brings me to my end for the moment, and now we will move over to David, and I'll be driving. So David, just let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
And if we can go to the next slide, please. So after you've done all the prior portions of this application process that Denise was mentioning, we're now into the assessment process. And we've already determined whether the organization is eligible, whether the project is eligible, and if the organization has the financial eligibility requirements met. So then the project is then gone and scored against our assessment criteria, which we will go through. And once the ranking process has been completed, additional considerations are going to be applied if applicable. So there are things such as sector distribution. This is over the 6 sectors that were mentioned earlier. We also have regional distribution and also some earmarking for Indigenous projects. And this is to ensure that the funds are evenly spread across the province to the best of our ability, both on the demand and on the supply side. Next slide, please. So the Capital Project Grant Program is really designed to support community identified needs and priorities. Its focus is on people, their needs, their development, and their involvement in that community. The community benefit section of the application requires details about the numbers of people that are likely to benefit and how they will benefit from the project and associated programming. You should include evidence of community support for your project and describe the needs or gaps the project will address. Please include information such as the following as evidence of community support for your project and describe the needs or gaps the project will address in your community. So it's good to discuss with us what the broader problem or need is in your community that the project and its associated programming will address. For example, it could be aging facility is unsafe and that there are no other services or of its type in that community. For example, within a 45-minute drive. There's a current gap in service that the proposed equipment purchase would enable. So for example, some of the Gulf Islands have had facilities that have completely worn out over the past 50 years and they've needed help in replacement. So we've helped some of those already. Describe the number and population of people who will likely directly benefit from the project and its associated programming in a particular year. An example you could write is over 150 newcomers and refugees in the Cowichan Valley, or perhaps 50 Indigenous youth ages 13 to 7, or all community members interested in salmon restoration. And lastly, perhaps you could even write something like 100 socially isolated adults over the age of 65 in the Vanderhoof area. Writing this kind of stuff will help the analyst understand the purpose and use of your particular capital project. If applicable, include details, numbers, or statistics to substantiate the community benefit. This could be taken in the form of share the findings from a recent community consultation study, provide a wait list of the numbers demonstrating that an existing facility has more users than it can possibly accommodate. And where possible, quantify the impact this project will have on the community if completed, such as the approximate number of individuals visits to the facility on an annual basis, or perhaps kilometer of trails maintained. Whatever makes sense in relation to your capital project. And lastly, in the section that deals with inclusiveness and accessibility, we're looking to see how the project is open and accessible to all people in the community, including people of all ages, abilities, sexual orientation, gender identities, ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, religions, languages, and other underrepresented communities and under social economic conditions. Denise? Now we're into the competitive scoring process. So we're going to look at the project feasibility. We want to see that there's a sound plan in place to ensure the project starts after funding has been provided and is able to be completed on time. Information we are looking for in this section covers the project timeline and the risks that are considered with that project. Also, we want to see a risk management plan. We also want to see an appropriate levels of approvals and permits have already been obtained, if necessary, and that the ongoing operation of the project is also viable. Remember, we're funding the capital project, not the operating costs. And then for those successful applicants, funding must be spent within 36 months of receipt. The project timeline should show how the project will be completed within that time frame, and projects must start within 12 months of receiving a community gaming grant. Next slide, please. Now we're into the competitive scoring process, and here there are financial considerations involved. So not only do we want to see a viable plan for the execution of the project, we want to see solid numbers on the financial aspect of the project. Here, we would assess the total project's cost and budget and how much grant funds are requested to complete the project and how the grant funds will be used toward the eligible expenses and that there are matching funds in place to meet that grant requirement. Next slide, please. Continuing the competitive scoring process, we also look at environmental efficiency. This section covers how the project includes climate action or energy efficient features that will help reduce the organization's greenhouse gas emissions, lower the organization's long-term operational expenses, such as heating or cooling costs, and how it can improve the use of the organization's human and or technological resources, such as reduced resource consumption. We understand that this may not be applicable to all projects, and applicants can note when this is not applicable and why. Next slide, please. The next category is spending the grant. And so grant funds, and this is all related to eligible expenses again. Grant funds must be used to cover those costs directly related to and necessary for the successful implementation of an approved project. You cannot divert any grant funds, capital project grant funds, to any other use. Projects related fees to pay to professionals or technical personnel such as consultants and contractors are eligible. Project materials such as lumber, kitchen equipment, transportation and or shipping costs for those acquisitions, licenses, permits, and insurance required for the project, and any other direct and necessary costs incurred in the implementation of the project. So as long as you can make that connection between it's a necessary cost, it should be eligible. Onto the spending rules. Organizations must have a separate account for receiving and holding and then dispersing those gaming funds. So grant funds are deposited into what we call an organization's gaming account. This will be a separate checking account maintained by the organization. Expenses. All eligible expenses should be paid directly from the gaming account. Grant funds may be transferred from the gaming account to a general operating account for the reimbursement of eligible program expenses. Checks or board-approved electronic transfers are acceptable. Under timelines, we have grant funds again must be spent within the 36 months of receipt, and the projects must start within 12 months of receiving the grant. No banking the grant funds. Documentation. Invoices and receipts must be retained on hand for 5 years. All grant recipients are susceptible to an audit for verification of the past expenses. Next slide, please. Under financial reporting. So all organizations that receive community gaming grants or have previously received a grant and still have money in their gaming account must submit a gaming account summary report. Organizations must also complete a capital projects grant supplement, the GASR gaming account summary report, and the capital projects supplement together report on all the spending from the gaming account during the fiscal year. The GASR details under the gaming account balance at the beginning of the year, fiscal year, shows grants received, grants, funds dispersed, and the year-end balance. GASRs also require a description of how the community benefited from the program and/or services supported by community gaming grants. The capital project grant supplement is an attachment to the report that focuses just on the expenditures related to your capital project grant. Capital project grant expenses must be consistent and comparable to those outlined in the approved grant application. GASRs must be submitted within 90 days of the organization's fiscal year end. Organizations must submit all recent GASRs in order to receive another community gaming grant or capital project grant. So no late reporting is the hint here. GASRs help us ensure that grant funds are being used only on eligible expenses, and a blank gaming account summary report and capital project supplement and example GASR documents are available on our website. So if you've never applied for a grant before, you can see what these documents look like, get a feel for what the types of questions are being asked and the types of information that is needed to be gathered to complete it. Next slide, please. So now we're on to project completion. Hooray, 36 months have gone by in a flash or less. And once your project is completed, you've got to notify the branch, and you can do so in writing at the following email address. We also would like to see a short post-completion report to include a description of the completed project and how it's now benefiting the community, a breakdown of the total project expenses, and some photos. The reason for this is the branch may request that these materials be used to publicize the outcomes of the capital project grant sector. In the past, the minister has gone out to visit some of these organizations and to showcase to the public, the greater public, the benefits of applying for a capital project. On to you, Denise.
Thank you, David. Okay. All right, so now we're going to talk about the application process. So as we mentioned a couple times now, the intake is open for 2 months, from the start of June to the end of July. And we expect that we'll be have our decisions made and notifications going out by late fall. When you apply, you do so online on our website. We don't accept paper applications for this program. So all the documents that are required as part of the application must be attached to the application. So no mailing them in or emailing. And you'll see as you go through the application, it won't let you advance without an attachment in several of the sections. If you are a new applicant to both the Community Gaming Grant and Capital Project Grant, you'll need to contact the branch ahead of time. And when you do that, make sure you've got your BC Society number, your operational start date, and your fiscal year end date to help set you up in our system. And before you apply, as I mentioned earlier, it's a really great idea to review the sector guide, as well as the resources on our website for valuable tips and information. And we've got things like frequently asked questions, we've got an application tutorial, we've got those sample financial statements and the reporting documentation that David was just talking about. So it really covers all aspects that you may have questions about. But some general tips and advice for applying. I'm sounding like a broken record, but read the most recent program guidelines. It's kind of your A to Z of all things capital projects. Review the pre-application checklist that's within the sector guide. That'll cover off all of those different areas and what you're expected to include with your application. As I mentioned, review the resources on our website, frequently asked questions, financial statements, and so on. When you're ready to apply, make sure you've saved all your documentation as either Word or a PDF for easy upload. And if you do have questions as you're preparing things or as you're going along, feel free to call or email us. We have someone available on our phone line every day. And finally, as we mentioned, make sure that if you have had gaming funds in the past, that your gaming account summary reports are submitted. So now I'll just go over a couple of resources to leave you with, and then I think we can get into the remainder of the questions. So the website that we keep talking about, this is the web address here, as well as the phone number and email where there's someone available to answer questions. As well, there's our community outreach manager, which is me. That's my email address that I can be reached at. And both myself and a policy analyst monitor this email address, and we're pretty good at getting back to people rather quickly. In addition, we have the BCACG, who is graciously hosting us today, and you heard a little bit about their role. But yes, they're really there to help liaise between the community groups and the branch. So they're there to help as well. And similarly, there's the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres. They're a bit more focused on Indigenous organizations, but they are also available to assist. And then in addition to that, there are several community charitable gaming associations. These are more regionally based organizations that support their charities in their local area. With their questions on the capital project grant and community gaming grant, and can also help assist with the application.